Use the word bedlam.
That's former President Trump in Washington, D.C., calling it a momentous day after spending the morning at the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals. His attorneys are arguing that he should be granted, or that he was protected by full immunity in the January 6th case against him. Special counsel Jack Smith's team is arguing, of course, that he was not. I want to bring in our senior reporter, Catherine Faulders in Washington, ABC News Chief Justice correspondent Pierre Thomas, ABC News executive editorial producer John Santucci, and senior investigative correspondent Aaron Katursky, as well as ABC News legal contributor Kim Whaley for more. Pierre, I want to start with you because we're hearing Trump go back now, renewing claims of what he calls a rigged election. You followed these cases over and over again as they played out in court. Can you put that in context for us?
Well, Diane, I think the first thing we have to say is separate and apart from the arguments that his attorney made in that brief, what I guess we would call it, press conference just now, and what former President Trump just spoke about. Look, those facts in terms of whether he has complete immunity are going to be litigated, and it will be resolved one way or the other. But I think, in fairness to our viewers, there's just absolutely no evidence of broad-scale election fraud. The former president went to 30 different courts and had an opportunity to make the case that there was wide-scale election fraud. It does not exist. It does not exist as far as the facts that we know of. And again, they're separate and apart in terms of whether the special counsel can make the case that the president did illegal acts while in office. That much we should be honest with our viewers and just say as fact. What he just said was untrue.
Kim, it relates to this case in that Trump's team is trying to argue that because he was searching for voter fraud, he was acting in his official capacity as president. What did you make of the way those arguments played out in court today and the way the special counsel responded to that and other areas of these arguments?
Very important distinction there in that his lawyer just now, Donald Trump's lawyer, made this argument. This is a slippery slope. Presidents have to have immunity. This is a disaster for presidents. The whole point of immunity is to protect acts that are legitimately within the scope of presidential power. Dropping drones pursuant to the commander-in-chief power is something presidents have to be able to do and not worry about being prosecuted or civilly sued. But as Pierre just said, there is zero evidence of fraud. The record shows Donald Trump was told that by his, campaign team, by his attorney general, by his closest advisors, and nonetheless, he pursued the big lie, election fraud lie, like he's doing just now in this press conference. And that's the question, is basically defrauding, as Jack Smith is alleging in the indictment, defrauding the American public. Is that legitimately within the scope of presidential power? That's what blows up his argument, because there is no limits. Donald Trump's lawyers don't have any legitimate limits around immunity, and that's what was upsetting the panel, that it's essentially greenlighting the massive powers of the Oval Office to commit crimes with no accountability, no impunity. And I really don't think this panel, or even the Supreme Court, if it goes to the Supreme Court, is going to do that. And when given, in the rare occasions, President Nixon, President Clinton, and actually Donald Trump with the Mazars case relating to his accounting firm, when given the opportunity to give unlimited immunity with other presidents, the Supreme Court has said no, and I suspect they'll do the same thing with these arguments as well.
And Catherine, you were in the courtroom today. Trump's team rather is trying to make the argument, and we heard it there, comparing his prosecution to prosecuting a president for a drone strike, for example. And we heard Judge Pan not necessarily push back on that, but start to question that, saying, okay, but what if a president orders SEAL Team 6, the Navy SEAL Team 6, to assassinate a political rival? Do they have immunity then? What was it like in the courtroom when the questioning went in that direction?
Well, it's interesting. I had a pretty good vantage point of Trump at that point when he wasn't obstructed by his legal team, looking for reaction there. He didn't really react, actually, to much of the questions from the judges. He looked at them, he observed what they were saying, he observed their arguments, but there were very few times in the courtroom where Trump showed some form of irritation or nodded in approval. For example, when his lawyer went up there to give a rebuttal, he was essentially making some arguments that the current administration is prosecuting Trump. That's one instance where Trump nodded his head in agreement. But I think Diane, what's extremely important to point out here, and what I've heard all of our colleagues talk about, and Trump's speech that he just gave, where he said they were stuffing ballot boxes, and what Pierre said about these claims not being true, it's just so important to remember that Trump's own aides, his current aides, have spoken to Special Counsel Jack Smith and have said under oath, behind closed doors, that they didn't see any election fraud, any evidence of voter fraud in any way, that people were telling him that. His own current top aides, his former top White House lawyers, his former chief of staff. So, of course, he is using the courthouse, which he plans to come to multiple of these appearances, to essentially use it as a stump speech on the campaign trail.
And, John, he didn't have to be in court today. He chose to be in court today. How much of this is political for him, and how is it affecting him politically?
It's all political. Every way that he can make this political, he's going to. Look at his week right now. So today he's in court, didn't have to be. He should be in Iowa. He's going there tomorrow. He's leaving Iowa, going to court. You'll be there in Lower Manhattan for the New York Attorney General civil case. Doesn't need to be there. You do. He does not, to be clear. But the reality is that Donald Trump is using this as a weapon. They're coming after me. I'm standing in the way of them because they're really coming after you, but I'm there. So I'm going to face these people down in court. Doesn't need to be. And as Rick Klein noted earlier, as Donald Trump exited the courtroom, his team blasted out a fundraising email saying, help us fight, help us go on. They are spending more money on legal bills for these 4 cases going on right now, 5 if you include the New York Attorney General's case, which is in closing arguments Thursday. More money there than on actual campaigning.
And, Aaron, he also brought in the Georgia case in Fulton County, talking about the DA, Fani Willis, accusing her of improper hiring of a prosecutor. What's the latest happening there?
Well, the arguments have been made by some of his co-defendants that the case needs to be dismissed because Fani Willis, the district attorney in Fulton County, had a prior relationship with someone who is now on the team prosecuting the case. We'll see how far that gets. But the former president is also arguing immunity in Georgia, saying, Diane, that the Georgia case can't go forward because, again, the actions he took were presidential in nature. They concede at the outer rim of presidential duties, but maybe not at the core of presidential duties, but still within the scope of his office. And I think all of these cases and all of his arguments turn on how far can Trump stretch the law. Totally. And at the moment, he's trying to stretch it pretty tight. And it even goes back to his conduct. When John Eastman comes up with this plan to have fake electors sit in place of the real ones and nominate Trump instead of Biden, even though Biden won the state. How far, how taut can that rubber band go? I think Kim Whaley may tell you it's being stretched beyond where it was intended.
Kim, I'll let you answer that.
Yeah, I mean, just to be clear, there is no immunity in the United States Constitution for presidents, period. There is a clause relating to congressional immunity. If members of Congress do things that are legislative, they get immunity. You can't sue them. So the whole idea of immunity is implied. It's not expressed. And the idea the Supreme Court has said is, listen, you have to have presidents have some flexibility. But the notion that there's no red lines that presidents can cross, that they are elected to serve the people, they take an oath to defend the Constitution. It is not a monarchy. And as Aaron indicates, it's if you look at Donald Trump's briefs, there is no line that they're legitimately drawing and saying, listen, this is what Donald Trump did. This is within the scope of president's power. But if you were to cross the line, then that would be a problem. And I think this is Donald Trump's campaign, is that, you know, the second Trump administration would be no red lines, would be no limits on the powers that he could exercise, even if it meant it would shock the conscience of the rest of us. And that's really what this court and ultimately probably the Supreme Court has before it, is whether Article 2 of the Constitution creates some kind of unlimited monarchy rather than someone who's ultimately accountable through the courts and the other system levers of accountability to the American people.
And Pierre, outside the courtroom, Trump is arguing that this federal case is the Biden administration and Biden's DOJ going after him because he is a political rival. And he said today, if this is how they want to win, there will be bedlam in this country. How concerning is that?
Well, right now, the Justice Department has been talking repeatedly about a certain and very concerning spike in threats of political violence. They've had threats against Supreme Court justices. They've had threats against political candidates. All this is a witch's brew moment, according to DOJ officials. At the same time, when I spoke with Deputy Attorney General Lisa Monaco recently, I pressed her on the notion of the backdrop, the appearance. It is a Biden Justice Department investigating his top political rival, likely the Republican nominee for president. And her retort is that the special counsel is investigating independently. I asked her directly if President Biden had ever spoken to her or the AG about any of these cases, and the answer was no. So the bottom line of it, from the Justice Department perspective, it is what it is. That they would not be pursuing these cases, they say, if there were not clear potential violations of the law. And we shall see if they will prevail.
Catherine, law enforcement sources tell ABC News the judge overseeing the federal election case was a victim of an alleged swatting incident on Sunday night. Special counsel Jack Smith was also targeted over Christmas. What's the latest on that, and what's the general feel in terms of security for the people who are working on these cases, the court officials working on these cases?
Well, look, we know that the judge overseeing this case has already had increased security for some time. It doesn't appear that there's any change, at least from the visual element of it when you're inside the court from that perspective. Obviously, we've reported on the Jack Smith incident. I think it just shows, Diane, this pattern that we've seen lately of federal and state officials being the target of these swatting incidents around the country. So no real changes. It doesn't appear, at least from me, to the security openly. These are federal officials who do have a large security presence, but certainly on high alert for things and instances like this to happen in the future.
And Erin, this hearing comes as ABC News learned exclusive new details about what some of Trump's aides testified to, including Dan Scavino, one of his closest aides, essentially saying that, as far as he could tell, Trump did not seem interested in stopping the violence on January 6th at all. How does that factor into all of this?
Quite the opposite, with Catherine's good reporting and others on the team, that the former president, as was established by the January 6th committee, was at the White House. He was watching all of this unfold. Aides kept coming into the room trying to convince him to say something, and he was just dismissive, to the point where when they told him about what former Vice President Mike Pence was enduring about being moved to a secure location and the chance of hang Mike Pence, what does Trump say? He just looks and says, "So what?" And that speaks to, I think, the kind of conduct that Jack Smith is getting at here in fomenting rather than working to pacify. And this is the former president's argument, him saying he had the right to do this because he was president at the time, and he was just trying to make sure that things were functioning properly. I don't know how you argue that January 6th was proper functioning of the American government, but his immunity arguments have been rejected in other cases. He's on trial next week in New York for a second time involving this woman, E. Jean Carroll, a writer formerly of Elle magazine, who's suing him for defamation. He has tried to get out of that case, saying he should be immune because at the time he made the allegedly defamatory statements, he was president. And a judge there found that that was outside the scope of presidential duties. So he's been rejected before, but he keeps at it despite despite those headwinds.
So, Kim, how do you expect this to play out? When do you think we'll get a ruling on this question of immunity and potentially see it go all the way up to the Supreme Court?
I expect it will be in short order. They scheduled the oral argument very quickly, and in a civil case, a civil case brought against Donald Trump around January 6th, a different panel of D.C. Circuit judges already rejected absolute immunity. So I think it'll be a quick decision. Then there could be an appeal to the entire D.C. Circuit, all of the judges, and then it would go up to the Supreme Court. I do think the Supreme Court would accept the case, and this is one, unlike maybe the Section 3 of the 14th Amendment, the other appeal, where I think based on what the court's already said about immunity, that the court will not accept this notion that there's no limits, there's no line. The presidents can do whatever they want. It's possible that in parsing the record, the majority could find certain aspects of it legitimately within the scope of a president's power, with the concern that we don't want to sort of clip the wings of presidents acting legitimately. But I agree with Aaron that in this moment to say what happened on January 6th is okay, is within the scope of what presidents should be allowed to do when their duty is to take care that the laws are faithfully executed. And that's what Donald Trump took an oath to uphold. And we all saw the chaos and the carnage on January 6th. So I think the Supreme Court will realize that. We should have a decision fairly soon. That does not mean, however, that the trial date in the January 6th case will hold, because there are other factors in play.
All right, Catherine Faulders, Pierre Thomas, John Santucci, Aaron Gutersky, and Kim Whaley. Thank you all.